we still have people joining, but I am going to go ahead and start, given that we have such a rich conversation ahead of us and just an hour to really dive into this really critical issue. First of all, thank you all for joining. My name is Stephenie Foster. Many of you who are joining, I think, are people that I've worked with or known, or that the panelists who I will introduce have worked with and known, and we're very grateful to you for being part of this. I have worked on issues around women and gender for many years, in addition to other things, working as a lawyer, working at the State Department, but really understand that right now we're at a critical time to really focus on what's going on with young women, teen girls in our country, in our communities, around the issues of violence, and particularly around the issues of sexual violence, and really the way that young women and girls are experiencing life. Many of you probably saw a CDC report which came out in February of 2023, which was based on what's called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is of high school students, done by the CDC. These were the results from 2021, so during the pandemic, but they were startling. And the press release that came out around the CDC report was titled "U.S. Teen Girls Experiencing Sadness and Violence." The statistics were alarming, though perhaps not surprising, unfortunately, really showing increases in young women and teen girls feeling sad or hopeless, 30% of girls seriously considering suicide, which was up 60% from just a decade ago, 18% experiencing sexual violence, up 20% in the last 5 or 6 years, and 14% forced to have sex without their consent. So we know these are big issues, and they're particularly, of course, even more exacerbated for communities, LGBTQ communities, Black communities, brown communities. And so we really wanted to take this opportunity to learn from experts who work in these fields every day, who can really talk to us about what we can do to make a difference. It's very easy to name the problem, or easier sometimes to name the problem, to think about what we can do to really address it. And so I am really happy and honored to introduce our 3 panelists who are going to talk to us about their work and also what they see in terms of what can actually work to address this issue. The first panelist I'm going to introduce is Shandira Davis, who's the manager of global community engagement, as you can see at Girl Up. Girl Up, many of you are probably familiar with, works with young women change makers, and has done a tremendous amount of work around all these issues. Shandira is someone who works a lot with adolescent survivors of intimate partner violence and has been a strong advocate for youth and survivors. Our second speaker is Lindsay Dearlove, the Global Director of Operations for the No More Foundation, which is a global campaign around ending violence. And they also do a lot of tools and resources, which she will talk about in her part of the conversation. One of the things that she has particularly done is to develop safe spaces, in particular online safe spaces, which provide support in a discreet manner for people who are the subject of domestic abuse. And our last panelist, last but not least, is Dr. Indira Hennard, who is the Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. I was on the board of the DC Rape Crisis Center so many years ago, so it's a small world. In addition to that work addressing issues of rape and gender-based violence in DC, she is also someone who is on the Independent Review Commission to address sexual assault in the military, that is under the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Biden administration. She's obviously, as you can see, been someone who's been recognized numerous times, serves on many boards, and has been an adjunct faculty member at both Catholic University and Howard University here in the district. I'm very happy to have these 3 panelists with us. We're going to just dive right into the conversation. So I'm going to start with Shandira to really have this first question for all of you. which I think is really critically important, which is from your perspective in your organization, what do you see as the greatest threats to teen girls and young women that you see the people you work with experiencing, and give us a sense of what you're seeing on a daily basis. I think this is important, just as to say as a note, there's a lot of policy discussion right now going on about what to do about this study and about these alarming rates of despondency, sadness, despair, et cetera. But I think it's really important for us also to get a sense of what people on the ground are hearing and talking about with teens and young women who they work with. So with that, over to you.
Thank you so much. I think, I, as you shared, am here representing Girl Up, which is part of the United Nations Foundation. And our work really is to develop transformative leaders, right? Our young change makers are activists in their own right, and they are advancing gender justice around the world. They are very clear about the things that matter most to them. They are fighting in their communities every day around equity for girls and women who face systemic discrimination and bias, right? And so for them, their work in grassroots movement with their peers is around social issues that intersect with gender equity. And for us, as we do that work alongside them, learning from them, and really taking their leadership as priority, what I hear in my youth programming work there every single day is about things like gender-based violence, teen dating violence, the absence of support around healthy relationships and what that means for them, and really the ways in which all the very marginalized identities that each of them hold are oppressed, and the ways that they are trying to dismantle that oppression together every day. I think it's important that we focus in and think about these things through the lens of what young people are experiencing every day in their communities. And I think to do that, we have to be honest about, the rise in teen dating violence. We have to be honest about the lack of comprehensive sex education in our schools. We have to be honest about the fact that, young girls around the world and their peers are every day faced with what may feel like insurmountable obstacles in the face of lack of resources, in the face of, some intractable things, right? We have issues of poverty, issues of, even gender-based discrimination in our schools. The places where young people are going for safety and support are so too often devoid of just that. I think another piece that is connected when we have the conversation around sexual assault, when we have the conversation around intimate partner violence and teen relationships, is also about the collateral cost of all of the things our teens are facing on their mental health. And that's something we hear from our youth every single day, that they are, struggling to find ways to be supported around their mental health. They are struggling to find avenues and channels and allies to stand with them when they are in mental health crises, or even to acknowledge the truths of what they are saying about the conditions around things like depression, things like anxiety, things like, even for us, because we support global grassroots movement workers who are youth, they talk about the collateral cost of organizing work and the burnout that they experience in their lives every day, and what it means for them to have safe places to go to have those conversations, but also to get healing center, trauma-informed, support, treatment, resources, the things that are necessary for them to thrive, even as they face, these kinds of obstacles every day. And so I think I spent a lot of my time doing work in communities, schools, faith-based communities, and even carceral settings with youth around the world over the past 15 years. And in that time, I heard again and how invaluable it is for those young people to know who they can turn to in moments of crisis, who they can talk to when they're experiencing things in their intimate and personal relationships that maybe they don't even have names or language for, and who they can then go to that will support them to go and get the word out to their friends, to their families, to their communities about what it is that they need from each of us. And so I think, as we think about some of those threats, as we think about the CDC report that you just shared, and other reports that have come out around what young people are facing, I think the most important thing that I hear more often than not is that, with the right resources, young people can make decisions that are best for them, but could be feeling like they are not alone in these struggles.
Yeah, let me just ask you one quick follow-up question. I think that's so important, the idea that they feel they have someone to talk to. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how you see some of these young people, young women finding someone that they feel they could talk to? Is it often a family member or is it someone outside their family? What's been your sense of that? I think that's a really important part of this discussion.
That's an interesting question. Thank you for it. In my past work, actually, I did teen dating violence work around the city of New York and schools there. And in that time, I ran focus groups across hundreds, actually, of middle and high schools around New York City. And what I got from that information from youth directly was that typically in times of crisis, they weren't actually going to parents and adults because those folks hadn't co-created safe spaces for them to do that. They were going to their peers. And they needed resources around how to share accurate, thorough, viable information with one another. Where can we point a peer to who is struggling? Where can we point a peer to who is in a relationship where we're seeing things that don't feel right to us, right? How do we have the language and the words to even hold space for one another in those times? And those kinds of things were absolutely missing from our education system.
Thank you for that. I think that's just an important thing for people to focus on, is where young people feel comfortable getting information, which maybe is a great segue. We didn't really plan this, but I want to go to you, Lindsay, and ask you the same question about what do you see as threats to young women and teen girls that you all work with through No More?
I think it's really important to say that No More is a global campaign that focuses on equipping and providing the tools and resources for the friends, family members, and the communities around those that are enduring domestic or sexual violence. So a lot of our work is about how we can provide some level of information and support. And so I think to answer that question from sort of our perspective, it's often something that sort of really continues to shock us to our core and sort of invigorate us to respond well, is how pornography is having such a huge impact on young people, and how the prevalence of it is so huge and often under anticipated, under sort of valued in how it's forming those impressions about what sexual relationships are like, what is expected of you as a young girl or woman, or what's expected of you as a young boy or man. And actually how many young people are seeing that so early on in their development around understanding their bodies, understanding interpersonal relationships. You know, we've quite recently seen a study come out saying that on average, most young people, boys as young as 12, young girls as young as 13, 50% of them have already seen pornography, often quite violent pornography. Often it's unsolicited and unquestioned. And then when you raise an age to like between 17 and 19, that's increasing to 73%. So what we know is that if your forming of understanding about what relationships or what any form of sexual behavior is based on something external to you where you can't question anything, that when you do experience something that doesn't feel right, you don't necessarily have the correct language or the tools or the resources within yourself to actually raise the flag to say this isn't okay. But also that the expectations on you as a young person can be incredibly oppressive. You know, we know there's many young girls who are saying that they are consistently being asked to, you know, share intimate photos of themselves, or the fact that they feel that that's what they should do. And they're not necessarily understanding the long-term implications of sharing that image. And so in some ways, what we see quite evidently is that there is, you know, exactly as Chandira said, is there isn't enough space where we're having these conversations around healthy dating, healthy relationships. And I think, you know, one thing we often talk about is that healthy dating, you know, once you're in that relationship, what's expected of you, how you behave, you know, and we have quite a number of resources and tools available from our perspective and across the sphere around how to date well and what to expect, you know, and in particular, we've got quite a lot of good naming language around interpersonal violence. But what we don't really talk about is that early stages of dating. And if you're using online dating sites, for example, or if you are, you know, finding new and inventive ways to date through Snapchat, for example, a lot of that behavior can really speed up, and there can be a lot of expectations on you to share very intimate photos of yourself or to jump stages in intimacy where you don't necessarily feel safe or comfortable. So I think for us, one of the biggest risks we have is that, you know, I can't echo enough, like what Shandira was saying, is that we are not creating those spaces to talk about healthy relationships. And, you know, we know, for example, that most people will not talk to their parents or caring adults, but actually their peers around them. And how do we equip them to feel safe and comfortable to respond? So I think one of the things we need to really focus on is, do we have the tools and resources that are up to date and ready and equipped to meet the consistently changing demands on relationships and expectations around sexual behavior?
Well, I want to ask you a follow-up question on that as well, because it is interesting in terms of where young people are getting information, right, about how they should behave, what's expected of them. Do you find that they are looking for an alternative to, you're saying people find a lot of this through pornography or perhaps talking to other kids, their peers? Are they looking for information that's different? Are they looking for information that is more sort of healthy, really, in this way? Or do they not see that that's available?
I think it's where we're actually sharing this information, and are we meeting young people in their space with this information? You know, quite recently we did a great piece of work with Tinder in the UK around early, like, healthy dating. And one of the really big pieces of information that came out from a huge study was that most young people didn't feel safe when dating online, but most people chose to date online, and that they were changing their behavior in order to make it feel safer for them. And in some ways doing incredibly imaginative things to do that. And so I think it's the case of us really thinking about how we deliver that information to them and how we create the tools and resources that are available and supportive enough for them to respond to.
Thank you. And so I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Hennard, with the same question. What you're seeing in terms of your work, in terms of young women, particularly teens, and how they're really perceiving what's going on in their lives right now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and it's great to be with you all. So at the DC Rape Crisis Center, we've been serving survivors of sexual violence for over 50 years, and we have a strong program as it relates to our teens and youth. And so one of the things we've been seeing, particularly within the last 3 years, at the height of the COVID pandemic, we are very much deep in the school system. And so when COVID happened, what we saw and what we heard was that home was not safe. And so we saw a lot of increase in sexual assaults in the home environment. When the isolation got lifted up and students and teen girls were going back to school, we saw an increase in sexual assaults happening on school grounds, right? And so in our conversations with teen girls, particularly Black and Brown teen girls, what we heard is that they want to be able to have an intergenerational conversation around sexual violence. And part of that is because what they found out is that it happened to their mother, it happened to their grandmother, but there was no conversation about it. The conversation was, it happened to me, I got over it. You kind of keep it moving. And so that was harmful in a lot of ways. And so not being able to have that conversation around language, that intergenerational conversation, not understanding your body, right? So what we also heard is that they weren't taught anything about safe touch and unsafe touch, and learning correct anatomical names to body parts, right, growing up. And so what they said is, it's too late, quote unquote, to have this conversation with us in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, right? We wanted to have that conversation growing up. And so what they've asked for is to really have on the ground in the school sexual assault curriculum so that they can really begin to have those intentional conversations. So that's one. I think the other piece is really being able to look at this work from an intersectional lens and really understanding that sexual violence should not be talked about and dealt with in silo, that sexual violence is not a single issue because we don't live single issue lives. And so always being able to look at it from an anti-oppression, social justice, racial justice lens, which is so critical. I think the other piece that we saw and what we've been hearing is that social media and technology is a big threat. And so what we saw in terms of our girls in schools is that, yes, there were sexual assaults that were happening on campus. And, to your point earlier, Stephenie, there's a lot of conversation around school safety policy now, et cetera, but also that things were moving onto social media, right? And so what that looked like in real time is that when a sexual assault occurred between two students from the same school, that it would sometimes spill out on social media in terms of that young girl maybe outing the person who perpetrated against her, right? And so then, students in the school take sides, and then it comes back to the school and the parents are wondering, well, how come he's not suspended, et cetera, et cetera. So the way in which technology is playing in our young girls' lives and the role that has on a micro and a macro level cannot be lost. And so this is why we're also seeing more conversation around tech companies and social media companies around their responsibility in making sure that the platforms that they are creating is safe.
There's so much on that I want to ask, actually probably later for the group, but I do want you, if you could, I'm very taken by the intergenerational conversation, because I do think it's goes to a lot of this issue of naming the problem and understanding that it's not just you. Can you talk a little bit about how that looks to you and what young people are actually asking for in terms of an intergenerational conversation?
Yeah, so let me kind of take the Black community, for example, and the Black church to kind of put it in full context. Historically and culturally speaking, having conversations around sexual assault, rape in the African-American community has been challenging, and it's been challenging on multiple levels. The main reason it's been challenging is around, to my point earlier, around being able to have an intergenerational conversation within families around sexual violence. And what I mentioned earlier around, we heard a lot from our Black girls and even Black mothers around, well, it happened to me when I was younger, right? And so I didn't have anybody to talk to, and I didn't know what to do when it happened to my daughter, right? So I told her what was told to me, which is, you move through it, you put it aside, you're still alive, you made it, right? And so it is that type of mentality that has been a barrier, right? And so what we have been trying to do, in addition to our strong partnership in the schools, we also have a strong partnership with the faith-based communities and really going into the churches, particularly the Black churches, and really having conversations with clergy and parishioners around sexual violence, and particularly what that means in the Black community. And those have been powerful conversations because it has been intergenerational. So if you talk to someone who is 60 versus someone who is 16, 17, or even 23, the conversation around sexual violence is going to be much different. Right? It's going to be much different. So for example, when we look at the national high profile cases around sexual violence in our country, let's take Bill Cosby, for example, right? The country was divided, right? And it was divided intergenerationally because, some folks did not understand, well, how does that constitute sexual assault? Right, so to speak, right? We saw that there. We saw that with the R. Kelly women who got sexually assaulted, with the US gymnastics women who got sexually assaulted. People weren't understanding the breadth in which sexual violence sits on in terms of the continuum. And so what young girls are really wanting is to be able to have a safe container and a space to really talk about what is happening to them, but also to be able to hear from others around what are some ways in which that they can not just move through the trauma kind of on a micro level, but what we've also seen with our teen girls is that they want to be activists around the issue, right? They want to be able to raise awareness, and we think that's fantastic. And so we, really believe that, young girls and young women are the GPS in which we take our direction from. And so when we went into, DC public schools and talked to, hundreds of girls and even boys around this issue, they came up to us afterwards and said, so how do we get involved, right? I think it's also important to mention that the issue around schools, not just the intergenerational conversation, the language, the social media aspect, but the way in which Black and brown girls' bodies in particular are being policed as it relates to dress code, right? That also has an impact in the way in which the school system is showing up around sexual violence.
Yes, many things there, which I think is a great segue to our next question. But I do want to first say to the attendees who are here, please put your questions in the chat. I have many questions, but I'm sure you do too. And I want to make sure that after we go through this next round of my next question, that you are able to, be part of the conversation as well. And we're also going to have a couple of polls, short polls that you can participate in as well, just to give us a sense of how you'd like to take action and where you're seeing these issues really play out in terms of your advocacy. But I think that's a good segue to the next question, which is for each of you, again, and maybe this time I'll start with Lindsay, is as you are, we've now talked about a myriad of things that are quite big challenges. But if you can really give us all, the participants and each other, a sense of what you think people can do in their daily lives to address these issues. And it can be it can be from the micro to the macro, it can be advocacy to, personal, doing something personally, whatever you think people need to think about, because I often find it's very easy, as I said, to think about these issues being huge and very, multifaceted and nuanced, and sometimes it overwhelms us a bit. So Lindsay, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to Chandra, and then to Dr. Hennard to really, again, give us a sense of what you think people can do to take action.
I think it starts with us as individuals, and to be really honest, in the fact we do have the opportunity to create those spaces, as caring adults, as parents, as aunts and uncles, as people within the lives of young people, if you're a coach, if you're a community member, to sort of talk about healthy relationships and healthy dating. We know young people want to have conversations about things that they're experiencing that don't feel safe or feel uncomfortable. And we need to, in some ways, be able to create that opportunity to showcase good examples of good relationships and highlighting spaces where people can talk about what doesn't feel right. So I think I'd always start with having that conversation. And we know it's incredibly difficult. And in most instances, young people don't want to talk to adults about this. It feels completely not the right conversation for them. And we find from some of our early sort of discussions that the first 20 seconds for an adult to have a conversation with a young person is often the most uncomfortable for that adult. Some people we've chatted to have said they found it really helpful if they're doing it when they're not facing each other, if you're sitting in a car or you're going for a walk, or if you're in the midst of doing something else, sort of broaching the subject can be really helpful. But just starting with, talking about it is really key. The other thing I'd always say is that if you are in that position where a young person sees you as a safe space or a safe place and they tell you something, we have to acknowledge our reaction has an impact too. Often we can't, it's very difficult for us as adults to control that if we are shocked or surprised. We often turn to our own experiences and we'll, sort of say in this instance, why did you share a picture of yourself? That was a terrible thing to do. Now you've got lifelong impact of doing this. But actually for that young person having that reaction, it's incredibly shaming and terrifying and silencing. And so I would really encourage us all to consider, and in some ways it's safer to say, give me a moment, I'm just stepping out and coming back into that conversation in a really calm and thoughtful way can be really powerful and helpful. The other thing is that, you may not feel like it, but you can often be the safe place for a young person who may not be directly connected to you. We really see a huge impact of, that young people's coaches have on their lives when they are in that space and they are trained enough and equipped enough to be able to have that conversation. We did a great piece of work here in the UK with the NFL and the young boys that were joining, that were starting flag football. And we were able to do this great project where we trained up young men and boys to be equipped to have this conversation in a day camp. And I think the one thing that they said is that they wanted to be able to have this space with their peers to talk about it, and having their coaches involved in this conversation felt really comfortable and safe. And with the right support around that sort of initiative, it became a great space to do it. And then I think the third thing I'd always say is that, we have great power as adults to be advocating for our sisters, our friends, our mates when we go out for lunch and stuff, to say, like, also you have this conversation. These are great resources. Often as parents, we sit in isolation thinking we're the only ones dealing with this difficult moment, but actually by collectively sharing some of the skills and resources we have, we might find a safer way through this for young people. And, I'll always echo this because I think it's the most important thing, is that we have to meet young people where they feel safest and enable them to lead the conversation and to feel that they're in control. Often lots of things are out of their control, and enabling them to have the control that they need can be really useful and powerful.
Great, thank you for that, Lindsay. Chandra, how about you? What's just some ideas for people to take action in their daily lives around this and things you've seen that work?
Thank you. I would echo everything that Lindsay shared, and probably, be adding things that I hear from our youth directly, which is the necessity for us to expand the availability and accessibility of culturally relevant, competent, gender responsive mental health and well-being services. I think, Dr. Hernard is right that we are remiss if we think that we're going to do trauma work and not be doing it through the lens of the marginalized identities our youth hold, not be doing it through the lens of race, ability, sexual identity, all of the things that folks know our young people are facing oppression around. And so, when we think about how critical it is at this point in young people's lives, particularly when we know that 50% of all mental health concerns begin by the age of 14, when we know that youth engage differently with services than adults, right? There are ways to be supporting the advancement of restorative and transformative approaches to young people's mental health, relating, intimate partner violence in schools that can be deployed by educators, by allies, by folks who are in a position as a mental health professional, but even in our homes and families. What does it mean for us to be teaching healthy ways to relate, for us to be, learning? And many times, this intergenerational conversation involves the learning alongside our youth around what is best in times of crisis in homes, right? And even that cannot happen without the distribution and access to really responsive and relevant information for families as well. I think, we often think about parents' discomfort having tough conversations, but even professionals can be that way, right? We know that it is true that there is also not the availability that there should be of folks who look like our youth, who experience life the way our youth do in mental health capacities, right? So creating those spaces for young people to turn is critical, but it also has to look like each and every one of us taking it upon ourselves too, to mention these things at home, to be in conversations, like I said, with grassroots community organizers to resource youth activism in their work on the ground, because they really are leading the conversations around these things and should be. I think, what it means to center the most marginalized in these conversations matter too, right? When we know that gender-based discipline in schools, which was mentioned here as well, is happening disproportionately to Black girls, right? When we know that there are places and spaces that are to be dedicated to young people's growth and evolution that are missing any real conversation about the challenges that they're facing. And so, I think about all of the ways that we are sort of all responsible and have some accountability to take around what it means to support young people through all of these crises. When we think about how the pandemic has exacerbated these things and highlighted inequity and disparity that has contributed to the rising rates of depression with our young people, we have to then be the same people saying, what does it mean for us to co-create a culture, right, of immediate and helpful and supportive response to young people when they do share with us what's happening for them, when they are saying in their schools and in their communities that this is what they're facing, right? And when we are the ones who see it firsthand, but are not even well versed in how to be the first responders for them, right? Our team at Girl Up are being trained in things like youth mental health, right? First aid, what it looks like to support young people and hold space for them as we make strong referrals to folks who have been doing this, right? Not co-opting the work of folks who have been on the ground with young people for decades, listening and hearing from them what they need. And so I think, all of those things come together and they look like us finding various ways by listening first to what young people are telling us.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Hennard, your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. It was definitely said, but what I will just add to the choir is, it cannot be lost on us just the importance of being able to just recognize and hold within yourself that young people know what's best for them. Like, they have self-determination. They need to have autonomy, right, over their body and their decisions. And so imagine what it would look like to create a space that young people are leading in, that young people are healing in, that young people are driving programming in, right? And to the comment previously around, and us just holding space, right? Stepping back and holding space. And so we've heard time and time again around to literally what was just said around how, adults, how we are co-opting space, how we are coming into young people's space and trying to tell them what to do, right? And so that is not the answer. And so I think in a season where we have to figure out how to adjust in this new normalcy of this pre-post pandemic COVID pandemic, as well as the racial reckoning, and really dealing with what I call the four traumas of the COVID trauma, the political trauma, the death trauma, and the racial trauma. All of these are impacting our youth, right? And so really being able to create programs and services that hands down have a direct response to racism and oppression, being able to really step into and partner with youth serving organizations, again, who are already doing the work, but also looking in non-traditional places that perhaps we would not have thought to look at earlier, right? So part of doing this work and part of truly understanding sexual violence work is knowing that there truly is not a walk of life that sexual violence does not impact, right? Does not impact. And so we really have to be intentional that we can't just keep going to the same places, So for example, there needs to be a lot more outreach and intention with our youth who are incarcerated, right? And what that looks like in real time, right? That's just an example. What it looks like when they are re-entering into society. What are the programs? What are the supports and services as it relates to that? I think the other piece, there is a crisis happening with, sexual assault organizations across the country, particularly rape crisis centers, because we're seeing the great resignation, right? Because we're in this new environment. And so, organizations are needing support in terms of volunteering, in terms of bringing your time, your talent, your treasures, right? Because we can't do this work alone. And so, my message to, folks is look at the ways in which you can not just show up for the work, but also show up for young people in your community and kind of what that looks like in real time. So for example, we co-partnered on an event a couple of weeks ago with Black girls in DC, right? And so we let them co-create the agenda. We let them co-create the space, right? Our job was to make sure everybody stayed safe, et cetera, those high level things, but we stepped back, right? And it was such a beautiful, beautiful time, because although we think that we are imparting lessons and, things like that, they actually taught us a lot, right? Right. So those are the spaces that I want to see a lot more of. And then I think the last thing I will say is that, anytime you are bringing together young folks, you can't forget, as it was mentioned, you can't forget about the families, right? You have to look at the entire family, right? So think about ways in which they can be included in the work. And what I will also say is be careful who you partner with, right? As it relates to young people. 9 times out of 10, folks may not want the police showing up or involved in any way for a variety of reasons. That's just an example. That's what's happening at DC on the ground. When we have events for young folks, when we're talking about, state sanctioned violence and all of that, sometimes, MPD may not be able to get invited to this one, right? So really be intentional about your partnerships and who you are inviting to the table, because that will be impactful and that can shut anything down quickly, right? And so again, if you're looking at this work from the intersections, then those are the things that need to be taken into consideration, in addition to who's being left out, right? Who's being left out, not just who we may not want at the table for a variety of reasons, but who needs to be at the table, right? So those are just some things to be mindful of.
Yeah, and I think to the three of you, thank you. Those are, I think, some very concrete things that people both can do and think about as they're structuring their thoughts about how to engage. We have some questions which I'm going to ask from the chat. But before we do that, I think we have one poll question that we want to have participants. If everybody's had a chance to vote, I think we can close that question. Let's do the second question as well, and then we'll have all of that. We can talk about it at the end. The second question is, what are the obstacles that prevent you from taking action? So if people want to answer that as well, I think that would be helpful for this conversation, and see what our responses are. To the questions in the chat, and I'm going to shorten up a couple of them, and know that also we have a lot of interest in the chat and being in touch with all of you and your organizations and the good work you're doing. So we will make sure that as appropriate, people get contact information for your organizations and for you. We'll work with you on that. But let me start with one question in the chat, which I think we kind of all of you touched on. And I'm going to start, Chandra, with you. And this is the role of men and boys and how we can engage men and boys around more healthy behaviors, around understanding their role. Particularly, I think the question was sort of framed in terms of healthy behaviors and also the pornography question. But I think just more broadly, how can we engage boys and young men and men generally in this work to ensure that we are not ignoring basically half the population that is very important to the conversation. conversation. So Chandra, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Thank you so much. I think in many ways, you know, the conversation around how we prevent sexual violence, assaults, gender-based violence starts with what we teach boys and male-identified children, right? Something that a mentor of mine once and always said was that if gender-based violence could be ended by women and girls, it would have ended long ago, right? If we could do that work alone, we cannot. It has to be done by folks across identities, because as Dr. Indira shared, this is not a single issue. We do not live single issue lives. And so really it is paramount that we think about the ways that we are socializing male identified folks in our society. We think about how we're raising children in ways that tell them that physical, verbal, and emotional violence, what it is and why it is not okay, in ways that we create open spaces for community and partnership between them and their peers who are experiencing gender-based violence. I, was a part of some work across the Northeast that brought together youth with all identities to be talking about these same topics, to be addressing these issues in their schools, and then to equip them to go out and address them among their peers, and to be leaders in the conversations, male identified youth to be leaders in the conversations around what it means to be safe humans themselves for their peers and for each other. I think all of that, I think when, we talk about men and boys, oftentimes people are focused in on the ways that they can be, the ones enacting violence or engaging in making choices to use violence, and not in the reasons why that happens, right? And not in figuring out what it means to decrease young boys' exposure to violence, and not in ways it means to think about what it means to ensure that folks have access to provide for themselves and their material needs, which we know is a driver of reducing violence, right? All of the kinds of ways that we can be missing opportunities to engage men and boys in this work and in these conversations mean that we are missing opportunities to really enact change around these issues.
Great, thank you. Lindsay, how about you?
I'd always start with, and a little bit sort of echoing what Shandira said, is that we've got to see men and boys as part of the solution and change the language, the way we address them in part of this conversation. And in many ways we hear from men, it's not all men, it's not me, but actually you may know somebody, and are you doing your best in every situation to not echo misogynistic language or misogynistic behavior, and recognizing that you have your own level of opportunity as a man in a young person's life, that if you put forward a great example, you think a little bit about how you speak to the women in your life, or what you're saying, what your jokes you're making, those small things can make a difference. And the other piece I would really encourage is, there are a lot of really fantastic male role models. And if we can enable them and equip them and encourage them to create the spaces that are where young men and boys are at, it's unlikely that they'd want to turn up at a session based on sexual violence. But if it's part of a sport that they're engaged with, it's part of an online and gaming forum, if that type of conversation happens as a side conversation, but it's quite structured, it's quite well informed and has a support around it, you're more likely to get a better response. And we just have to recognize that young men and boys want to hear information in different ways. And I think, something that sort of will always resonate to me is that young men and boys are the brothers, they're sons of women in their lives that have experienced sexual violence or intimate partner violence, and they are growing up in homes where they themselves are victims too. And I think that we have to sort of acknowledge and recognize that young men and boys suddenly become an adult and sort of opt out of that caring space, but how do we ensure that they have the mental health support that they need whilst growing up in that home and experiencing and witnessing that level of violence? I think there's two parts in that. So yeah.
Great. Dr. Hennard.
Yeah, so I definitely co-sign everything my colleagues said, and I just want to take it a step further, and it's going to be a little different response. And I'm gonna give the disclaimer that I'm coming to this as a trained social worker and a mental health professional, in that I've been in the global sexual violence movement for over 20 something years. And so in that, I've had a lot of conversations, particularly with our male allies and our male colleagues. And, one of the things that I consistently hear to this day is the struggle that our male allies and colleagues have in getting invited to the table, and getting kind of considered as a part of this movement. I say that to say that I ask those of us who are female identified to really think about the ways in which what we are bringing to this work, right? And I say that to say we all bring something, our personal kind of experiences, et cetera, et cetera. And most folks who do this work, they come from a personal place, whether they have experienced sexual violence directly, they know someone, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we have seen, time and time again, and historically, is sometimes there is a barrier to embracing and inviting men to the table because we still have to work on our own stuff. Right. And I say that, and again, sometimes this is intergenerationally. So I want to go back to that. Right. And so I say that to say, and I tell my staff, I tell everybody the same thing, that you cannot effectively do this work until you do your own work. Right. And so we know that men and boys are survivors. We know that they can show up as allies and supporters. We know, to Shanjira's point, that we cannot do this work alone. And so we need everybody at the table. But even in 2023, our male identified counterparts are still struggling to be able to kind of show up in a way and have a voice in this work in a really intentional way. And there are some male organizations that have done a marvelous job, right, who have been on the forefront, but there's still more to get involved. And so I say that to say that, we all got to deal with our stuff and work with our stuff, but to be mindful of, if there is resistance, right? And again, this has happened intergenerationally, to inviting men to the conversation and the table. Think about why that is. Right, why that is. And I say that because if you look at historically how this work has started, how this movement has started, there's some things there that are still resonating today, in terms of when you think about the first, the second, the third, we may be in the fourth or fifth wave of feminism now, right? All all of those things come to play, right? And then if you add the racial piece, it gets even more exacerbated. So I say that to say that sometimes it's not just about what folks can do, but sometimes we have to look internally about, are we being the barrier?
Yeah, there's so much to say here, and we're coming to the close. We have a few minutes left. So I want to just say a couple of things and then ask one last question. There are some great questions in the chat that we probably won't get to, but I know that Angela has put the websites for the three organizations in the chat as well. And so please reach out and find out more about what each of these great organizations are doing and how you can engage with them in your communities, in your work. And you can ask the questions and make sure we're able to really get you really more engaged in this issue. We've heard a lot about having conversations with young people, about being a safe person to talk to, about being culturally kind of competent in this work and responsive to the needs of young people, focusing on their mental health, teaching healthy ways to relate. All of these things I think are critical. The one question I want to close with, and I will say I want to thank each of the panelists, because I have learned a lot, and it just always impresses me about how deep the expertise is in all of the work that gets done in this field and how nuanced it all is. I mean, this is just hard. These are not easy conversations. I know one of the questions, which we're really not going to get to, is about how to have these conversations when you're in an environment where it's hard to, maybe there's a policy against talking about certain things in schools, and how do you get to that? So these are hard issues. But there are 3 or 4 questions in the chat that I'd like to just quickly go around before we close, that all go to how to volunteer, or if there's no organization in your area, what can you do? Or if you are a women's club or some kind of group, how do you connect with other groups that work on these issues? So very quickly, in our 3 minutes left, maybe each of you just say a couple of points about that before we wrap up. And I will start with Dr. Hennard, and then go to Chandra, and then Lindsay, and then we'll close. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the great things about us having to pivot and adapt in the COVID pandemic is that, we learned how to do our work virtually, right? And so even if there's not a particular organization in your area, I still encourage you to reach out to whatever organization that you may feel called to reach out to you. And a lot of orgs have ways in which folks can volunteer virtually, can support virtually. So I, encourage you to kind of look at that. The other thing is that you may want to reach out to some of just the national sexual assault organizations who are also connected to, other folks who are on the ground, who can kind of give you some guidance in terms of the ways in which to partner and be supportive. And of course, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and it's one of our biggest months of the year. So, following orgs and kind of seeing what they're putting out, ways to kind of do action items and volunteer is always great as well.
Agree with everything that you just shared. I think, zooming in, some tangible things are, working alongside your peers and colleagues in your workplaces and school system, to be having these conversations, to be discussing what it means to stop sexual violence and to support survivors. I think, coordinating with folks near to you. There doesn't always need to be an established institution that you can go to, but often there are grassroots folks on the ground doing this kind of work that you can partner with, that you can coordinate community events with, that you can raise awareness, talking to the youth around you and seeing, different ways that you and your community members and family can get involved. There are ways to be thinking about how we approach our legislators, right? How do we support prevention and services for survivors? I just think, there are a number of, even across what we know to be a digital divide, ways to be connected in community around this work, because it doesn't happen in silos and it will not happen individually alone.
Thank you. Lindsay, the last word is yours.
I agree with everything that everyone said. The thing that I would sort of say is look to yourself and what resources you have at hand. You sharing where people can access support is always going to be really helpful and useful. And all of the agencies that provide the support, the NGOs that deliver specific support services, require that echoing of helplines and hotlines, and from a young person's perspective, or from any person's perspective, if you're experiencing any form of intimate partner violence or sexual violence, the spaces that you occupy where you could access support vary. And so the simple things like having in challenging your employer to put a poster up in your bathrooms and your toilets can be really, really impactful in someone's life. Use your social media channels. It is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Reposting and sharing helplines and hotlines and information about what sexual violence is can impact someone without you even realizing. And I think the ultimate thing and echoing is that if you are thinking about doing anything around fundraising, always reach out to your local provider. We're always sort of tilting on the edge. And I know that there are things like, packs that if someone's experienced sexual violence, new clothes, new toiletries, all of those in those moments can be really powerful and useful, and everything can count. So reach out to that local service to see what they need.
Well, thank you so much.
I could add one thing, Stephenie.
Yeah, sure.
It would honestly be, before I left this call, and I just thought of it, it would be to stand up for survivors and believe them.
Ah, yes.
First.
Perfect last word.
Yes, perfect last word. And I can't thank the three of you enough. A virtual round of applause for all of you. Also, thank you so much to the people who joined. We had a great turnout today, great questions, really a lot of engagement. This is a critical issue. It is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. It should always be Sexual Assault Awareness Month is my view, but this is a month where we particularly pay attention to this issue. So again, thank you all for joining. Thank you to the panelists for really honoring us all with your presence. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.